Okay, people, we're heading off in a new section today, and we're going to be considering over these next couple of chapters, how do we know that Jesus was actually the Messiah? And we're going to be, over the next week or two, we're going to be looking at a couple of chapters, Matthew's chapter 8 and 9, where Matthew argues the case by looking at some miracles. And the first one we're going to look at is this miracle of Jesus, where he heals a man with leprosy. But Matthew's perspective in approaching these miracles is interesting. You see, the Old Testament predicted that a Messiah was coming, and Christians, of course, claim the name of Jesus as the fulfillment of that prophecy, and continue to do so down to this day. Jews, for the most part, even to this day, they still reject that Jesus Christ is the Messiah of the Old Testament writings, and most believe that they are still waiting for him or this figure to appear. So maybe what I would like to try and do today is ask us, how do we know that Jesus Christ is the Messiah as promised in the Old Testament books of the Bible? Well, in a sense, that's the entire purpose of Matthew's account of the life of Jesus. It's to prove that supposition as factually correct. In Matthew's day, for the most part, the first century Jews living in Roman-occupied Palestine and beyond believed that the Messiah had yet to come. But they also believed that when he would come as a conquering king. He would come in a way in which they would see him kick out the Romans and set up the millennium kingdom, a sort of Jewish kingdom and state. Now, in his gospel, one of the ways that Matthew tries to prove that this person, Jesus, is in fact the Messiah, foretold in the Old Testament, is by describing for them and for us today the miracles that Jesus performed. As a matter of fact, in the following couple of chapters of Matthew, which we're going to look at, you see, we've just come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and these next two chapters, chapters 8 and 9, in Matthew's account, he is going to focus on giving us his eyewitness account of some of these miracles of Jesus. You see, as we've got so far into this gospel, we see in Matthew's narrative, first of all, he uses his own words, if you like, to set the scene. Then we have this long section where we have had the words of Jesus himself in the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus delivered his teaching on the kingdom of God and the principle of inner righteousness before God instead of just an outward, just for show, religious righteousness and rituals. But now we reach the point where Matthew's going back and giving a written account of the miracles of Jesus that he witnessed, and he's doing that in chapters 8 and 9. And he's saying that these miracles are being given to A, demonstrate that he is the Messiah, and also to demonstrate that he has the power of God within him. So we first heard Matthew speak, then we heard Jesus and his words and his message, and now we will see how he demonstrates the truth and the power of that message by these miracles. The things that he's able to do by the power of God, by the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, you'll forgive me if for a moment I just play devil's advocate for a minute. But still, the question remains is, how do we know that these miracles prove that Jesus is the Messiah? I mean, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus himself said that there were going to be people in the future and on the day of judgment who were going to say that they'd done wonderful works in his name. Furthermore, we see in the Old Testament the magicians in Pharaoh's court, they seemed able to do miraculous things. So how can we say that these miracles here, described for us by Matthew in chapters 8 and 9, how do they prove that Jesus is the Messiah? So to answer that, we're going to have to look at them in some detail, and we're going to spend the next week or 10 days doing that. So let's begin today by looking at the beginning of Matthew chapter 8. But actually, just before that, let me give you an overview of these next chapters, if you like, a bird's eye view of these chapters and these 9 miracles that are going to be presented to us. 9 miracles that are actually put in groups of 3. So the first group, there is a healing of a man with leprosy. That's chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. Then there is the healing of a centurion's servant in chapter 8, verses 5 to 13. And then it continues in verses 14 to 17, where there's a healing of Peter's mother-in-law, and also some mention of other miracles, although they're not described in any detail. Jesus then takes a moment to talk about the cost of discipleship, the cost that people will have if they choose to follow him. And then there follows a second group of 3 miracles. And these consist of the calming of the storm, the casting out of demons from a demon-possessed man, and the healing of a paralyzed man. And that's 8:23 through the first 8 verses of chapter 9. Then after that, another third group of miracles will follow, which will consist of the healing of the ruler of the synagogue's daughter, swiftly followed with the healing of the woman with the problem of continual bleeding, and then another healing of a demon-possessed man. Then finally 2 men are healed, and a man suffering from mutism is also able to speak. So the miracles are going to come thick and fast over the next few days, and we're going to look at each of these, bearing in mind that they are written within 3 groups of 3 miracles, but maybe we'll actually look at the miracles one at a time over the next number of days. So today we're going to look at the initial group of 3 and the first miracle within it. But let me just add, before going into that in detail, this first group of 3 depicts Jesus' power over disease. The second group of 3 will portray his power over nature. And then finally, when we get to the third group, it will depict his authority, the authority to forgive sin, and in fact, his power over death itself. So today we're just going to look at the first group of 3, and let me open by reading to you from the beginning of chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. Which tells us, when he came down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. So he's just come off the mountain, remember, having delivered the Sermon on the Mount to his disciples and the crowds that gathered also. So he comes down from the mountain, great multitudes follow him. And behold, a man with leprosy came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed, and Jesus said to him, See that you tell no one, but go on your way and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So I'm going to stop right there at verse 4. I'm going to pause for a word of explanation about this. Obviously this is the healing of someone, a man with leprosy, and it would be good to talk about leprosy for a minute and what was significant about that disease at that time. You may also notice that during my discussions on leprosy, I will not be using the term leper that was used by many and has been used by many and is still used by some up to this day. I have some experience in the understanding of this disease. My father was for over 40 years was director of a mission organisation called the Leprosy Mission, which was formed in 1870 and reflected some of the views at that time when it was called the Mission to Lepers. My father at that time was part of the decision-making process that changed that name to the Leprosy Mission, as he saw the term leper around the world being used as a term of derision, as a term of not looking as to someone as an individual made in the likeness of God, but rather defining someone by the disease. And he felt that it was an offensive term in the same way that we would feel very many disability or even racial epithets are now unacceptable. But anyway, in the ancient world, as today, leprosy was one of the most terrible of diseases. So like I say, I myself have some understanding of the background to this disease, and in fact my wife and myself travelled to countries like Pakistan and Nepal, where we reported back on the work of the Leprosy Mission in those countries, and we saw its effects on people firsthand. But in the ancient world, then as today, leprosy was one of the most terrible diseases. It begins with little nodules, which become an ulcer, and then the ulcer suppurate and begins to develop a foul-smelling discharge. In some cases, the eyebrows droop, and the eyes become staring and unblinking. Now, this is due to nerve damage around the facial muscles, leading to eventual paralysis of the blink reflex, and which then very quickly leads to blindness. The vocal cords can become ulcerated, the voice can become hoarse, the breath becomes wheezy and smells very bad. the hands and the feet often usually ulcerate. Slowly, the sufferer becomes a mass of ulcerated skin, and as the disease takes its course after a period of years, it also leads to mental decline and ultimately death. But along that disease journey, leprosy through nerve damage causes the loss of sensation to the extremities of the bodies. The nerves are so affected that the muscles begin to waste as they're not receiving nerve signals anymore, and the tendons contract until the hands are like claws and the feet are drawn in, and thereafter follows the complete ulceration of the hands and the feet. And then that, of course, leads to progressive loss of fingers and toes due to secondary infections, until towards the end, a whole hand or a whole foot may have just become an ulcerated stump. The duration of this terrible disease on average is anything for 20 to 30 years when left untreated, meaning that people suffer a kind of slow progressive death in which the individual, in a way, kind of dies inch by inch. But there's another problem that confounds the effects of leprosy, and that was the fact that then as today it was a contagious disease, and therefore the Mosaic law declared that someone with leprosy had to live apart from society. But how they did that and responded to that requirements was not done in a compassionate way. So this meant that those people at that time who had this terrible physical disease, they also had to deal with the huge social stigma attached to it as well. They could have no social contact or relationships with anybody else. As a matter of fact, the law that governed what someone with leprosy could do and not do was very long and protracted. Biblical experts will tell us that at the time of Jesus, there were 61 different laws that regulated the conduct and contact of people with leprosy and other people. And other schools of thought were even more extreme in their approach to it. Generally, if people got too close, they had to cry out leper so that someone would not get too near to them. But for example, one rabbinic school taught that one shouldn't even buy food, even from a street where a person with leprosy had passed through recently. Another rabbi boasted that he flung stones at people with leprosy to keep them away. In reality, most people, they took to the heels at the first sight of someone that they thought might even just have leprosy, even if they just saw them at a distance. There has probably never been a disease that so separated one human being from another. However, the person with leprosy in this story, he comes right up to Jesus and he asks for help. He needs physical healing and he needs cleansing from being a social outcast as well. And Matthew chapter 8 tells us that he came and he worshipped Jesus, saying, "Lord, if you are willing, make me clean." Now, by the way, the word translated worship here actually means a physical act. It means he actually knelt down and he offered himself in subservience and obedience to him. That isn't always what we would normally think of when we think of the word worship today, but here Bible experts will say, the experts in the language used at that time to write these texts say this is definitely a description of a physical act here, a physical act representing a posture of heart towards the Lord, and that he would have been kneeling before the Lord. At any rate, what we can tell is this man obviously believes totally that Jesus is Lord, and he believes that because of that the Lord can heal him. And the fact that he has leprosy means in a way he has even more faith than just normal people by breaking those boundaries in faith in the knowledge that Jesus can do something about it. So he asks the Lord to heal him, and the text tells us that the Lord then put out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the man with leprosy was cleansed. The remarkable thing about this story, and don't miss it, friends, is that Jesus is seen to have touched him. This was perceived as a highly contagious disease. No one would go anywhere near these people, much less touch them. But Jesus touched him and he said, "I will, be clean." And it tells us that immediately he was healed of his physical disease. And of course, that means he would have immediately been cleansed from the social stigma that was attached to that disease by one simple touch from Jesus Christ. And look at what the text says next. Jesus then gives him a command. He says, "See you tell no one, but rather go on your way and sow yourselves to the priests and offer the gift, as Moses has commanded, as a testimony to them." So why did Jesus heal this man with leprosy and then send him immediately to the priests at the temple? Some would perhaps argue that his motivation to heal was because he was a man of compassion. And there's certainly real truth in that. That is the motivation, and that sometimes that is stated in this and other gospel accounts as the reason, the motivation for doing some particular miracles elsewhere in the gospel. It says he did it simply because he took pity on someone and wanted to relieve their suffering. So on one hand, there's no question that that's something of what's going on here. But he doesn't tell everyone to do what he told this man to do. He didn't go to say to the others, go to the temple and do what it says under the Mosaic law. Present yourself to the priest there as someone who is healed. Also telling him to take the gift and to show the priest that he had been healed and give the required gift of thanksgiving that the Mosaic law required. And to do that as a testimony to the fact that God had healed them. Now let me remind you that one of the official jobs of the priests at the temple was to determine if anyone was claiming to be Messiah, to determine if they actually were the Messiah. There was this thing called the messianic hope deep within the culture at that time. So what Jesus is doing here, well, at least in part, is saying, yeah, go tell the priests you've been healed. But he knew that meant that they would come and investigate the man who had done the healing, because by doing that, they would be investigating the claim that he had been miraculously healed, which was one of the signs of the Messiah to come. Now, as we get deeper into the Gospel of Matthew, this will become a significant point, and at which point I'll break off and discuss this more when we get to it. But at this juncture, I just want you to know that Jesus has healed and cleansed someone with leprosy. And at one and the same time, he has brought about a physical healing and combined it with freeing them from social isolation and stigma. Now, why did Jesus do that? How does that prove Jesus is the Messiah? Well, this miracle and the follow-on from it doesn't go into a lot of detail, but the next one begins to unpack it a bit more. So I'll just keep going in the text, picking up at verses 5 through to 13, where it tells us, "Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, 'Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented.' And Jesus said to him, 'I will come and heal him.' The centurion answered and said, 'Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it.' When Jesus heard this, he marveled, and said to those who followed him, 'Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' Then Jesus said to the centurion, 'Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done.' And his servant was indeed healed that very same hour." So this is the second miracle in this initial trilogy of miracles. Okay, folks, let's remind ourselves of where we're up to by revisiting the text and what happens when Jesus enters Capernaum and a Roman centurion approaches him. So we're picking up in Matthew chapter 8, verse 5, which says, "Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, 'Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented.' And Jesus said to him, 'I will come and heal him.' The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this one, Go, and he goes, and another I say, Come, and he comes, and to my servant, Do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great a faith, not even in Israel. So this is the second healing in this series that are going to be described for us over the next couple of chapters, and it's the healing of the servant of the centurion. So first of all, let's just talk for a moment about what a centurion was and what they did. In the Roman army, there was such a thing as a legion, which consisted of 60 groups of 100 men, 6,000 soldiers. And each of those 100 men had a centurion who had authority over them. Someone has said they were the cement that held the Roman army together. They were, in a sense, a sort of elite soldier who had risen up through the ranks of the Roman army, and because of their position, they would have enjoyed some extra benefits attached to their position. Now, this centurion, he had a servant, probably one of the benefits of his position, but that servant is dreadfully sick. Now, the Greek words used here to indicate that he was unwell, actually, I read in one commentary that it actually means that he was in excruciating pain. So the centurion comes to Jesus and he says, Please heal him, please heal my servant. And Jesus says, All right, I'll come back home with you and I'll heal him. But the centurion then says, You don't have to come back to my house, just speak the word. And then he goes on to say, I'm a man under authority, and I understand that people under me, I give a command and they do it. So I know you don't actually have to come to my home. I know the authority you have, so just speak your word, and I know that it will be done. And Jesus says in response to that, and to the people around him, Wow, I haven't found faith like that, even in all of Israel. Here's a man standing before Jesus who understands who he is, understands the authority that he has, and he understands the power that he has. But at this point, Jesus does something interesting. He not only agrees and issues the word of healing for the centurion's servant, but he then takes the opportunity to draw attention to this situation and, in a sense, is supposed to teach the others, his disciples and others around a lesson. One of the very real characteristics of Jesus' ministry is every time he saw something happening in the real world, he would tie it into something spiritual. So he would use what was happening in the moment, and that's very much a case in point here to what he uses as an opportunity to teach his followers. But then look what he says next in verse 11 through 13. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, Go your way, as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And the servant was healed that very same hour. Now, this phrase about being cast out into outer darkness, where there will be a weeping and gnashing of teeth, this is interpreted by some as referring to hell. Now, I have to confess I have a couple of problems with that interpretation. But I have to admit, before I tell you this, I must confess that I have for years had great difficulty with this passage of Scripture. I've wrestled and grappled with it for a very long time, because for me there's some problems in interpreting the verse that way. In verse 10, he prefigures what he's about to say, this thing about being cast out and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth, by saying, I say to you. So we need to understand, it seems to me he appears to be talking specifically to those who are following him, people like his disciples, yet at one and the same time he's talking about lost people. So the real problem, I suppose, the nub of it is our interpretation of the phrase, the sons of the kingdom, which he uses in verse 12. Now, it's also something he will use later in the Gospel of Matthew, of people lost, but lost in a certain way, and he specifically states that and uses it in this way in other places, like the parable of Matthew 13. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of that now, but I'll get into it more when we actually get to that chapter 13 and deal with the parable of what's called the parable of the tares. So it seems to me what he's doing, he's talking about people who have made a decision at some level to be followers, but he appears to be talking about them in terms of them being cast out in this way, which is a little scary, because if he's talking about believers, does that mean that we can be cast into this outer darkness phrase where there's going to be a weeping and a wailing and a gnashing of teeth? That seems particularly problematic if you're interpreting this to mean hell. Like I've said, I'm not going to be specifically dogmatic on this, as this passage has given me no end of difficulty over the years, but in my estimation, I've reached the point and I'm at peace with believing, well, it's my contention, by interpreting this passage within the context with when it sits, and especially within the context of what Matthew's trying to do in this chapter in relation to presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy of a Messiah, that we have to contend with this till we can come up with a solution. What I found helpful was when I did some research to ask what the meaning of this little phrase outer darkness meant, because it's not a common phrase. In fact, if you look it up in the New Testament, you'll discover it only appears 3 times. And in all of those 3 occurrences, it only appears in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 2, it appears to give us an image to help us understand what it means to feel isolated, to be set apart from when others around you are receiving blessing. And in Matthew chapter 2, it's spoken of a banquet, where he uses the illustration of a banquet, where there are those who are inside the banquet hall, and there are those who are outside the banquet hall, and they are stated to be in this outer darkness, this darkness outside. And what I found helpful was understanding that sometimes this phrase is translated outer darkness, and sometimes it's translated darkness outside. And some would say it's perfectly reasonable to translate it that way, darkness outside, when coming to this phrase Jesus has used here in the situation of Matthew chapter 8. The idea of being in the darkness outside and being in the outer darkness, well, it has a different type of vibe, doesn't it? Doesn't feel quite the same to be in the darkness outside than it is to be cast into outer darkness. So the picture that is being used here is saying that some are going to sit and celebrate, if you like, with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and others are going to miss that joyful experience. They're not going to be in a position in that banquet. They're going to be outside in the darkness. But that's just half of it. What about the wailing and the gnashing of teeth? Well, that's a phrase that sometimes it's almost entered into modern parlance as referring to hell. But that's not exactly what's going on there. It's a metaphor that is used within Scripture to paint a picture of not specifically what hell is like, but it is more used to be a phrase that would describe any situation where one would experience great grief or suffering, usually when there's some kind of loss. Now, some Bible scholars have come to this passage and have come to the conclusion that what this passage is teaching about, that some believers are going to get into heaven and the marriage supper of the Lamb, but because they didn't have great faith, they just believed enough to get through the pearly gates, so to speak, that they're not going to be able to enjoy sitting down at the banquet at which the rewards for the faithful will be given and distributed. They're going to be outside of that. And because they're going to know it's happening, they're going to be there but not be there in a sense, there's going to be an intense feeling of grief. But the grief is over the fact that to some level they've wasted their life here on earth, maybe knowing that they only came to faith in later years, having years and years and years of opportunities presented to them to which they could choose to accept Christ and live the Christian life, and chose not to the last moment. I'm sure there will be a sense of regret in heaven for those that have done that. As a matter of fact, one commentator I read said, and I found this quote helpful, the wailing and the gnashing of teeth speaks of the describing of a grief experience by true Christians over the wasted opportunities of life. So rather than the joy of those with great faith that some will experience, others will experience a sense of grief at the loss by not serving the Lord or being obedient to his word in the life lived. And I believe the point Jesus is making here is not one about the difference between having faith and no faith. It's about the difference between having a little faith and having a great faith, a richness of faith. Look again at the context. In verse 10, he says, "Assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." So those with great faith, or to use the phrase in James chapter 2, which I think is really good, he said, to those who are rich in faith, they are the ones who are going to sit down with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and celebrate, in a sense, with no regrets. One preacher I heard suggest that this is a picture of those who are going to be seated with Christ. They're going to sit with him, while others, yes, they had enough faith to believe that Christ was the Son of God and who got into heaven. They're going to experience a sense of loss, a grief, because they didn't have the richness of faith in the life that they lived. In other words, they didn't follow the Lord in their earthly lives. And at the banquet, they're going to be outside of that in a sense, and in a sense sort of spiritually wishing they'd spent their life living for Jesus Christ rather than what they did. Anyway, back to the main thing. The main point of the text is Matthew is describing a series of miracles. Now, it's also good and useful to know that these miracles are not presented in chronological order. Matthew doesn't say that that's what he's doing, and that, it would appear, was not his intention. We know that by comparing this passage with other passages in the Synoptic Gospels, which would tell us that Matthew is deliberately arranging them to demonstrate something, and what he's doing is he's demonstrating that Jesus is the Messiah. So first, Jesus heals the man with leprosy, and then Matthew uses the illustration of him healing the servant of the centurion. And then in the process, by the way, he says you need to have a great faith like this guy. He uses it as a teaching moment, a God moment, to say, look at this guy. You need to have a faith like this guy in order that you can receive the full blessings, not only in this life, but in the life to come. And that's where the point where it brings us to the third miracle in the trilogy. And this one's really interesting because the Lord will heal Peter's mother-in-law. So let's pick up the text in 8:14. When Jesus came unto Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left, and she arose and served them. When evening had come, the people brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out spirits with a word and healed them, all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself bore our infirmities, he bore our sins. So interesting. First of all, here, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Now, in another account of this in the Gospel of Luke, we know that Peter actually asked for Jesus to do this. So we can assume that Peter considered this a real blessing. Just in case any of you were planning to insert a mother-in-law joke at this point. But Luke tells us, in addition to what Matthew said here, that Peter actually considered this a blessing upon his household. Now, we're told she has a fever. Now, there were several different types of fevers described by record keepers from those days. One was called, what we would suppose call today, a malaise fever, which was marked by weakness and wasting. It would often last for months and months, and would frequently end in a complete decline, which ultimately finished in death. But there was another one called an intermittent fever, which was a little something like our current day typhoid fever. Now, this was a type of fever that was apparently very common in that part of the region of the Holy Land, probably because of the mosquitoes that bred nearby. And many commentators think that that's the kind of fever that she had. Either way, the point is both types of fevers were in a sense chronic and were seen and experienced to have no cure at that time. And both led to a pretty miserable experience and existence for those who had it. So the party comes in and they discover her ill with this fever, and the text tells us that Jesus again, he touches her hand and the fever left her. Now notice, this is an instantaneous healing, to the point that she immediately gets up and begins serving them. So the point being made here in the text very strongly is that the healing is immediate and was so complete that she was able to get up and go about her activities of daily living, indicating just how complete this healing really was. But then it tells us that the word gets out about this and the other things that he's been doing, and by evening a mass of people have appeared, bringing with them the sick and the demon-possessed, and it tells us that he heals the sick and casts out demons. Okay, at this point, we've looked basically at 3 miracles. The miracle of the healing of the man with leprosy, the second one, the healing of the centurion's servant, and the third, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. But the whole point of it comes down to these verses now, where it talks about him doing wider healings, wider miracles, and it tells us that this was done that it might be fulfilled, that which was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, where it says, he did these things where he took upon himself our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. And by the way, that's a direct quotation from Isaiah 53 verse 4. In other words, Matthew is saying, I just described to you these 3 miracles and beyond, and these miracles are absolutely the fulfillment of a prophecy concerning the Messiah. And these miracles that I'm recording for you now, his Jewish readers then and for us today, they're recorded to demonstrate that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and that by doing these miracles he was fulfilling that prophecy of the Messiah. Now, just before we move on, I feel we need at this point to just pause for a moment and make a very important point. There are people out there today who teach that Jesus died for sickness and ill health in exactly the same way as he died for sins. And by teaching that, what they therefore say is that if you believe in him, he will heal you of all sickness. And I really feel I need to say a word about that. Let me be clear. I believe that as Christians we should be praying for the healing of one another. If someone is sick amongst us, we should go and lay hands on them and pray for them and ask for healing. But I do not believe that Jesus died for sickness like he died for sin. Jesus died for sin, and that means that the moment anybody trusts him, they are forgiven. And that is true. But if he died for sickness in the same way that he died for sin, then at the point of trusting in him, we would be healed immediately, right away, of everything. But we all know that there are people who trust in him who aren't healed all the time. And all of us, unless the Lord returns, all of us at the end will become sick and die. That's the sensory, physical reality of the human experience. So we need to be able to explain that. So those who quote this verse and say he took our infirmities and bore our sickness, and that means they can preach that because he bore our sickness on the cross, therefore that you can trust in him and you absolutely will be healed, by nature also suggesting that if you don't get healed, it's because you've not got enough faith. Well, we have to answer that by making the simple observation that he bore the sickness through his life, not his death, through the fulfilling of his life as the Messiah on earth. Now, please, friends, don't misunderstand me. I believe God can and does heal people. He can do anything he wants. But that's radically different than saying that Jesus died for sickness, like he died for sin. And therefore, in a sense, they're saying he has to heal you if you're ill, and it's only your lack of faith that stops that healing happening. Because that perspective is really, really different from the true biblical perspective, I believe. It's really obvious from reading the New Testament with just one eye open and your brain engaged that even within the biblical narrative, God doesn't heal everybody all the time. Paul, one of the great heroes of the Christian faith, had a physical problem, which he referred to as his thorn in his flesh, all his life. And he repeatedly asked the Lord to take it away from him, and the Lord said no. So the Bible does not teach that Jesus, on the death of the cross, died for sickness in the same way that he died for sin, and thereby implying that God has got to heal us all the time. I think that teaching hurts a great many people. A great many people who embraced it and didn't experience healing will often walk away from the Christian faith. And even more tragically, some reach the end of their life and they view death as a failure of their faith rather than the victory in Christ that death really is. I think that's the real tragic sense of this teaching, that some people lose their sense of the security of their salvation. They have it robbed from them at the very last moment by this incorrect teaching. Anyway, having said that, let me just draw together what we've said here. Jesus here, now, in chapter 8, has been seen to work, three main miracles for us. And we've run through them together rather rapidly. And we get down to the end here, and Matthew tells us why he has told us about them. The whole reason he's put them in the narrative. And that's because he wants to show us that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy, and thereby that proves he is the Messiah of God, foretold throughout the whole of the Old Testament. But I don't want us to just stop here with that, because Matthew is going to go on and tell us something else that's very pertinent to this discussion. So I'll just begin by picking up and reading for you from verses 18 to 22, which says this: And when Jesus saw the great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Then a certain scribe came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Then another of his disciples came to him, and said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead. So, after giving us these miracles, which Matthew's done in order to prove to us, to testify to us that Jesus is the Messiah prophesied about in the Old Testament, Matthew then gives us some information about what it will mean to be a follower of Christ. And he talks about discipleship, and he gives us this rather interesting story of two men who are declared to be followers of him, disciples, who come to him to talk about following him and being his disciple in the future. Now let me just pause at this point and say, because most of you have been with me on this biblical journey for a while now, you'll know that there's a difference between salvation, between achieving the inheritance, the blessing of being a child of God, and discipleship itself. Being a child of God is one thing, but being a disciple means that you're a student of Christ and a learner and a follower of him. The Greek word disciple actually just meant student or learner, and there's very clearly a difference between being a child of God and being a disciple, a learner, a student. So now at this point, Matthew is not talking about Jesus talking about in any way becoming a child of God. He's not talking about salvation. He's talking about becoming a disciple, a follower of Christ, a learner, or as a great favourite of mine, William Barclay, the Scottish theologian, he described it and he said probably the best word to communicate this in contemporary English language is about becoming an apprentice of Christ. So the first of these men in this narrative, they come to Jesus and he says, I will follow you wherever you go. And he's not just saying, I'm wanting to follow you on your next tour around Galilee. He says, I'm prepared to be committed to you for the rest of my life. But listen to this rather unusual response Jesus gives as a statement to this man. And he says, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So Jesus is saying, right, I understand what you've just said to me. I hear what you say. You're saying you're going to follow me. You know who I am. I'm the Messiah. And by the way, he's just proved that by the miracles he's done. But Jesus reminds him, look, I have no place to lay my head. Not even in the way the animals do. So what does that mean? Well, it means, in a sense, he's warning the man, telling the man that if you're going to follow me, this is not exactly going to be a life of comfort and ease. The life of being a disciple can be difficult and costly. And he's telling this guy, and he will the other in a moment, in essence, that this is going to be a life of perhaps some physical discomfort And at that time, it meant following him, he would be on occasion sleeping under the stars. And he pointed out that even a fox has a hole to go into when the weather's inclement, and birds have a nest. But if you follow me, you'll have none of these basic things at times along the way. In other words, it's going to cost you, my friend. Okay, then the second person comes and says, so this is another disciple of him, and he says to him, Lord, let me go first and bury my father. But Jesus says, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. By the way, it's important to remember that this person is someone who has started to learn. The very fact that they're described here as a disciple means that they've begun that process of being a follower, of following Jesus around and sitting under him, hearing what he does, taking in what he's teaching. But clearly, he's not a completely committed disciple. And that suggests to me that there is, to some degree, levels of discipleship and levels of commitment among people who are disciples of the Lord. Maybe some of us listening to this have learned things from the Lord, but we've really not learned all that we should have learned, or certainly not applied some of the things that we've learned. So a disciple is someone that's already made a commitment to become a learner, and this guy says to him, yeah, I want to do that, Lord, but let me first go bury my father. Now that sounds like his father has just died, and that makes Jesus' answer sound rather harsh, doesn't it? Let the dead bury the dead, he says. Well, if your father has just died, that would indeed be kind of a harsh thing to say to someone. And as a matter of fact, if his father had in fact just died, then he would have been buried within 24 hours, and the grieving ceremony would usually have lasted no more than a week. So what he's really saying is he is at the very least saying, Jesus, give me a week. And Jesus' reply is, in a sense, it's like nothing doing. Let the dead bury the dead. But I don't think that's everything or exactly what's going on here. I think there's something else to be dug out of this text. You see, this phrase, let me bury my father first, doesn't necessarily mean that his father had died at that point. Language experts who know about this stuff better than I have pointed out that he could have said this, and it could have meant that his father was still very much alive. And what he was really saying is, look, I can't make a commitment until my father has passed away. And that could have in fact been years. In other words, Jesus is pointing out that this is an issue of priority. This man, he says first, let me go bury my father. And Jesus says, if you're going to follow me, you've got to have your priorities straight. You've got to be prepared to count the cost and get your priorities in the right order. I have got to be the priority in your life from this point forward, and I have got to come even before your father and mother on this occasion. Now, the point with this example used here by Matthew from the words of Jesus is the same as when he uses other examples when he talks about getting their priorities straight. That's the point. So when this man is saying, let me go bury my father, he is in fact saying, let me wait until my father dies. Now, in fact, I'm told today that this is a Middle Eastern and African expression that still, to some degree, is used today. I heard of a recent example of this. I talked to someone, interestingly, of course, in the West, in the UK, but it was they told him about a student who was a guy from the Middle East, and they were students together at university, and he suggested to that guy that after he finished his university, he join him and take a gap year, and they should do maybe a tour of Europe together. But that young man explained to his friend that he couldn't do that. I would have to bury my father first, he said. So our friend, the English student, said, oh, my condolences, I didn't realise your father had just died. And he said, no, he hasn't died yet. And then he explained, I must fulfil my obligation first as a son before I'm free to make decisions to do things like that. You see, embedded in cultural thinking in many parts of the world outside Europe and North America, it's embedded so much that it no longer needs to be expressed in this very explicit way that this man did with Jesus that day, but it's embedded within the culture of those societies that it would be seen as completely unacceptable to finish your education and training and then immediately feel you're free of your obligations to your family and to go off and do exactly what you want with your life. They supported you through that time of training and development. and there is an expectation that you should now fulfill that role and support your family and the wider family around you. And that, I believe, is in a sense is what is going on here, which is why Jesus says to him, "Let the dead bury the dead." Now that phrase does strike us as a little bit odd. I'm sure it did me the first time I heard it, and it does a great many people, because you'll ask, well, how can a dead person bury a dead person? Well, of course, Jesus is using this word dead here in two different ways within the one sentence. The dead meaning that there are people that are spiritually dead. Burying the dead, they're burying those people who are physically dead. I once read or heard where someone illustrated this point by saying, do you realize that on occasion the man driving the hearse can be physically alive but spiritually dead, i.e. separated from God? A man in the back of the hearse, in other words, the one in the casket, the one who's physically dead, but they are spiritually alive, separated from their physical body, but spiritually alive and present with the Lord. And that's what Jesus is going on about here. So at this point, we've worked our way through the first 22 verses of chapter 8 over these last, 3 days? And I think this is a good place to stop and remind ourselves again of the point of this chapter and the chapter that's coming, the big picture that Matthew's trying to paint for us here. The point of this passage is really rather straightforward, in that it is simply saying that Jesus is the Messiah, and part of how we know he's the Messiah is because he filled the prophecies, and because of that, and we recognize he's Messiah, then we ought to follow him. And this, of course, would have been a message which would have been particularly relevant to Matthew's main readership at that time, the Jewish people who were waiting for the return of the promised Messiah. But now he warns them, and by nature us who are reading it today, that choosing to recognize him as Messiah and then choosing to follow him and be a disciple of his will have a cost for you. And that cost begins with you making the decision to put him first. So in my conclusion of this part of these first 22 verses, I'd like to finish today by making 3 simple observations. Observation number 1 is that this passage is teaching that Jesus is the Messiah. And then the question is, how do we know that he's the Messiah? And we know that he's the Messiah because he fulfilled the prophecies. Now, we've only really looked at and focused on one type of prophecy and one aspect of prophecy, in that he fulfilled it and how it references to what Matthew's teaching here in terms of the miracles he produced. But Jesus fulfills all of the Old Testament prophecies. Now, there are many, many more than just the few we've referenced here. There are hundreds of them, in fact, and some of them he will fulfill on his first arrival, and some will fulfill when he comes back again. There are at least 200 or 300 direct quotations on the Old Testament of prophecies that are fulfilled in the New. And I'm going to quote some of them for you now, but I'm only going to quote the ones that in the New Testament that are applied to Jesus and considered to be fulfilled in their entirety in his first coming. There are many, many more beyond this. Daniel 9:24-27, Deuteronomy 18-15, Ezekiel 37-24 and 25-27, Hosea chapter 11 verse 1. Isaiah is full of messianic prophecy. Isaiah 7:14, 8:14, 8:22 all the way to 9 verse 2, 9 verses 6 and 7, chapters 11 and verse 12, chapter 28 verse 16, and Isaiah 53, that whole chapter virtually. Then there's Jeremiah in chapter 31, and then there's the prophecies of the birth and the placement of it in Micah chapter 5. There are messianic psalms, Psalm 2, 16, 22, 34, 69, and 110. They're the main ones, but there are others. It's also talked about in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and the Song of Solomon references the messianic coming in chapter 2 verses 12-20, and then Zechariah 9 verse 9. Those references, by the way, will appear within the transcripts. You can look them up later. But imagine this, all these people writing this down hundreds of years before Jesus Christ even appears. You know, there's nothing like this in any other religion in the world. There's nothing like this in any other book of literature. There's nothing like it in any other philosophy. There's never been anything like this on this planet. And just one way that we know that we can know Jesus is the Messiah is the fact that he fulfilled these messianic prophecies and that he authenticated them by doing miraculous things. But wait a moment, you might ask, didn't other people do miracles? Didn't people do miracles in the Old Testament as well as the New? What makes the miracles from Jesus different to those of Elijah and Elisha, or indeed in the New Testaments with Peter, Paul, and the other apostles? Didn't Elijah and Elisha both raise people from the dead? There are miraculous events described, done by mortal men in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Even the disciples in the book of Acts did things that were miraculous. But the important thing, folks, is all these people did those things by praying to God. Jesus, he did them by saying, "I say to you, Lazarus, come out," Jesus said at the doorway to his tomb. God may have on occasions given mortal man the power to do miraculous things, but there is no mortal ever who has been able to stand up and do those things in his own power. Jesus is the Messiah, and because Jesus did it in his own power, we're able to recognize him as such. And nobody has ever done anything like that before or since, and no one ever will. And that is what makes him unique. Second observation I want to make is, secondly, you should become a disciple, but that should be done by making a decision. Let me just explain what I mean by this. Our response to Christ as Messiah should not just be an emotional response. Let me, if you'll forgive me, get quite rational about this for a moment. If Jesus is the Messiah, then obviously we should trust him as our Saviour and follow him as our teacher, right? Of course we should. And very frankly, on the other side of that, if he's not the Messiah, if he didn't die for our sins and raise from the dead, then as the Apostle Paul said, then if that's the case, we're still in our sin. And frankly, we might as well eat and drink ourselves to death. But if Jesus is the Messiah, what this tells me is don't waste your life, but you have to make a decision to follow him. I heard a sermon in the preparation of this message where the preacher said, and I've adapted it a little bit so it fits more with our thinking in these times, but it said basically Jesus had no servants, yet they called him master. He had no education, yet they called him teacher. He had no medicines, yet they called him healer. He had no army, yet they called him a king. He won no military battles, yet he still conquered the world. But on the other hand, he committed no crime, yet they crucified him. And they buried him in a tomb, yet he still lives today. I feel honoured to be a disciple of, to serve such a leader, such a Messiah. And I am so blessed that God, by his Holy Spirit, has revealed the truth of his Messiahship to me. But never get away from the fact that the decision to accept Christ as the Messiah of the Old Testament and your Saviour requires you to make a decision. It's much more than just an emotional response. One final observation, observation number 3. If Jesus is the Messiah, and he is, then we should follow him, and we should decide to do that. But if we do that, then we will have to count the cost. And that's what we've been discovering today. Let me make it clear that this going to heaven, getting into heaven, that part of this is a free gift. The Bible says that in plain English. The gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Romans 6:23 tells us. We receive that gift by faith, and faith alone in Christ alone. It's a gift, and I think it is the most needed message and gift that people can receive and is available to everyone on this planet today. But also because I think that the greatest human need at heart is that of knowing unconditional love. I also believe that this gift of God would solve a lot of the psychological problems that people wrestle with in life. because many of the problems people struggle with today are the result of not knowing that they're unconditionally loved. The knowledge of the unconditional love of God revealed as Christ is incredible, and that itself is also free. Romans said we were justified by his grace. Get that? Make no mistake about it. That's free and it comes without cost. But being a disciple, making a decision to follow Jesus and being a disciple for the rest of your life, that does come at a cost, because being a learner is costly, and that means that we may face some discomfort and difficult choices along the way. Because that means you've got to put him first. And that is only the beginning. As we walk together through the rest of this Gospel of Matthew, we shall begin to see how difficult some of the requirements of a disciple are. So though the cost of discipleship to us can mean some hardship, the cost of our salvation was nothing. But we still need to count the cost of our salvation, for the cost of that for Jesus was everything. Salvation may have cost you and I nothing, but it cost Christ everything. The discipleship that follows on that, however, will cost us something in this life, because making Jesus the ultimate authority in your life will have its price. If you really make the decision and you want to go on that journey of discipleship with the Lord, you've got to be prepared to understand toll that journey will take on your life. Jesus does not want you just to be carried away on a tide of emotional feeling, because that will ebb and flow. Yes, he wants to connect with you emotionally at your point of need, and that may involve, at your point of salvation, a great sense of joy, or indeed a great sense of sorrow and tears. But having done that, he then wants you to make a decision to follow him. A few years ago, I read of a biography of the explorer Ernest Shackleton, and it talked about that when he was building up his teams of intrepid polar explorers, he was inundated with people offering their services. But he had to weed out the emotional, the romantics as he described them then in those days, and the unrealistic, by saying, yes, it's great to have you here and wanting to do this, but are you prepared, he said. Are you prepared for the hardship? Are you prepared for the snow and the ice, for the exhaustion and the weariness of it all? And it's the same today for any young person who wishes to become an elite athlete or to participate at the top level in any sport. You know, you can start off and say, yeah, it's great. You love to play this game. You've got natural ability in your chosen sport. But are you prepared for the self-denial? To not be going out drinking and partying with your friends and following a healthy lifetime and regime? Are you prepared for that self-discipline? Because one without the other will not win the race or enable you or your team to raise the cup. Friends, it's true that there is no thrill in life like the way of Christ, and there is no glory at the end that is better than the glory that awaits us. But Christ never said that the journey in this life of being a disciple was going to be easy. The way to glory always involves the cross. For him, it was the cross of Calvary. For us, it means surrendering, giving up the best of us. You see, naturally, I think we're inclined to be lazy. Naturally, we're often inclined to procrastinate. We also at times will experience fear and indecision, and often a bad impulse will overtake us, or a good impulse will not actually be acted on and turned into action. For some of you, it might be God speaking into your heart and saying, yes, you've got to make a decision, but you've got to make that decision and got to make it today. Saying today, for some people I'm sure listening to this today, this is the very moment where they need to make that decision to follow Christ before it's too late. And they need to make it, to do it at any cost. And if that's you, God is saying, get out of this life and get into his life. And he's also saying, be brave, don't wait. And God will give us the strength to follow on from that decision. But it will truly be a tragedy if that passes by as an unseized moment. I say to all of us that this passage reveals Jesus Christ as the Messiah, the Son of God, And it also says, yes, there's a cost in following him, but there is no cost that is too great for us to follow him. And by doing that, we can be happy in this life, but better still, we will be rewarded in the next. Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah who is promised in the Old Testament. And in this series, we've been working together through the Gospel of Matthew, and I actually suggested that one of the main reasons Matthew chose to write his account of the life of Jesus was because he wrote it in order to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, the King of Israel. He did that primarily because he was writing to a Jewish audience at that time, but also it's important when we consider the Hebraic roots of our faith, and we can tie it all together in that way. So when it comes to what Jesus did, proving and demonstrating that he was Messiah, there's probably no better section in all of this book or any book to demonstrate that than in chapters 8 and 9 of Matthew. In the preceding chapters that we've been looking at, well, if you remember 5 through 7, he gave us that lengthy discourse where he addressed both the disciples and the crowd that gathered around in what was called the Sermon of the Mount. But now we've arrived and we're part way through chapters 8 and we'll be going into chapter 9. And what we're seeing is Jesus doing a series of miracles. Now we know by comparing this passage with other passages of scriptures that these miracles are not listed in chronological order. They're not listed in the order in which they happen. They're listed in order of meaning, which immediately tips us off to the fact that Matthew has quite another point to make. You see, what he wants to do, he wants to demonstrate, as I said, that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, and we can know by examining the miracles and seeing how he arranges them and what he says about them, what he's actually trying to teach us here. Now, we've already noted a couple of days ago that these miracles are grouped into 3 groups, and that within each group of miracles there are 3 miracles in each. So a couple of days ago we began looking at the first of this group of 3, and it consisted firstly of the healing of a man with leprosy, followed by the healing of a servant of the centurion, you remember that, and then they followed a very short section where he talked a little bit about the cost of discipleship, the emotional and personal cost that people might have to face in choosing to follow him. And then it is about to describe some other miraculous healings. Now today we're beginning to look at this second group of 3 miracles, and I want to ask the question why Matthew piles up miracle upon miracle for us. What more could we want to know than what we've already taught with those first 3 miracles? They already demonstrated that Jesus Christ had power over illness and disease. What else is there? What more could Matthew possibly want us to know? Well, apparently Matthew thinks that there is more that we can benefit from knowing, and he tells us what that is in this next group of 3 miracles. We shall now see how he calms a storm, casts a demon out, and heals a paralytic man. So what do these miracles do to help prove that Jesus is the Messiah, and what is different about them to the first group of miracles? Do they tell us anything that the first 3 miracles didn't? Now we need to remember as we study through these chapters, bearing the fact in mind that at the end of the first group of miracles, Matthew had said that Jesus had something to say about discipleship. That was at the end of the first group, and he's going to do the same again at the end of this second group. So what does all this have to do not only with identifying Jesus as the Messiah, but what it means in terms of us being disciples of Christ? Well, to answer some of those questions, I'm going to suggest over the next few days that we go through these 3 miracles and try to capture the essence of what I think Matthew is trying to tell us. So I think it's going to be 3 episodes, and I'm first of all going to look at the 3 miracles, and then I'm going to look at what Matthew wants to teach us, what he feels we need to learn about discipleship by studying them. So with that in mind, let's begin with the first of these 3 miracles, and it begins in chapter 8, verse 23, where Matthew is heard to say that the disciples call out, "Wow, even the winds and the waves obey him." So, picking up Matthew 8, verses 23 to 27, it tells us, Now when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose in the sea, so that the boat was covered with waves. But he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. But he said to them, Why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? Obviously, this is the miracle of Jesus stilling the storm. So let's just look at that for a brief moment. Now, obviously, this is the miracle, the famous miracle of Jesus stilling the storm. So we're just going to look at that for a little while. And we first of all notice that there's a storm. Now, it's useful to know a little bit about the storms that were whipped up in the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is not a huge body of water. It's basically about 9 miles long by 12 miles wide. And these, of course, were experienced fishermen. They had fished on the seas of this lake for many years. That's how they made their living, in fact. But what we need to take account of, what we need to know about the Sea of Galilee is the fact that it was surrounded by mountains, particularly on the western side, and that there were gorges through those mountains, and when the wind came blowing through the mountains, it was compressed and caused very strong gales to come through the mountain passes and hit the lake, and storms could be whipped up very, very quickly. So on this occasion, they're crossing the lake, and remember, Jesus has just done a very lengthy period of teaching and preaching, and he's been going around working his miracles now, so he's no doubt, in human terms, tired, which is why, well, straightforwardly, he goes to sleep. But then we find this situation where he's in the boat asleep, and the disciples are in the boat, and they're in the midst of this sudden storm, and yet Christ is there just sleeping. So the disciples come to him and try and wake him up, saying, Lord, save us, we're perishing, we're going to die. Isn't it interesting, I feel, that the storm didn't wake him up, but they came to wake him up? Just as an aside, interestingly, I grew up in a house for the first 10 years of my life, which, although it was in a rural setting, was quite close to the main Belfast to Dublin railway line. The line ran closely by, and it was between stations, so the trains were going quickly. And the railway line was probably less than 100 yards from the edge of our garden. But you know, because I grew up in that environment, I never remember really noticing it. I knew the train was there and I remember hearing him, but never in a way that disturbed me. I do remember occasions in the garden when we were playing with friends. Occasionally the conversation would have to stop for a moment as the train went past, and then we'd just continue. But really, growing up in that environment, I adjusted to the sound. I knew that the train would go past before every quarter before the hour and every quarter after the hour, all the way from before 6 in the morning to the last train at 10:45 in the evening. Even in bed at night, I can remember the distant sound of the train going past at 8:15, 8:45, 9:15, 9:45, 10:15, 10:45. And in a way, that sound almost became comforting to me, but I kind of sort of zoned it out. But I remember my mum telling me that when I was a baby, she could sleep through the sounds of the train because she'd lived there for, I think, 7 years before my older brother came along. And she got used to the trains passing, and they never woke her in the night. But she said that if in the middle of the night either my brother or I made the slightest whisper or whimper, she would sit up in bed and hear it. Now, I've seen this story, these events of the storm on the lake and Jesus asleep, many times, and I think they kind of miss this part of it, the fact that God bends his ear towards his children so they can always hear us, even when all around can be a cacophony, or it can even just be the cacophony of the mess of our daily lives. So God hears us. He has an acute ability to hear us when we need him. So in this situation, they turn to the Lord, they go to him, and they say, you got to do something. We're in danger of dying here. And I think it's worth saying that there are really two storms going on here, aren't there? There's the physical storm on the Sea of Galilee, and there's this other turmoil in the souls of the disciples. What I find fascinating is that these guys are the experienced fishermen, and they're going to someone who in a sense was just a carpenter to help them navigate the storms of the sea. But I believe that they turn to him because of their growing understanding that this man Jesus is much, much more than a carpenter. Which is why he says to them, "Why are you so faithful, O ye of little faith?" So he actually rebukes them, doesn't he? Now, he probably does this because by this time they will have already seen him do those miracles that Matthew's just described for us. Amazing things. And they ought to know that this situation would have been not only entirely possible for him to deal with, but if he was really God's Messiah on earth, it's very unlikely that God's plan for him would be for him to perish in the storm of the middle of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus asks them quite reasonably, "Why are you afraid? I'm here. This is just a storm. Why are you afraid? Just trust me, trust God." But then he gets up, and having rebuked them, he now turns and he rebukes the wind. In my mind, it's almost like he rebukes the wind as if the storm was just a naughty boy. And the text then says that the sea and the wind immediately calmed down. In fact, it says a great calm came upon the lake. Now the disciples are awestruck again, saying, "How can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?" What was probably not lost in them was the religious writings that they knew contained what we call the Old Testament today. Their religious writings that they knew. It clearly taught that God was the God who could calm the seas. That's specifically mentioned a number of times. For example, in Psalm 107 verse 29 and in other places. So by doing this particular miracle, Jesus is not only calming the sea, he is demonstrating that he is the God and has the power of the God of the Old Testament, the one who calms the storms. But some have also noted that there are two storms being dealt with here at once in this story. There are two storms in the light of the first one, which is the storm on the lake, and the second is the storm of life, which is the storm in the hearts of the fearful disciples. And we all struggle through the difficult times of life in that way, and at times it can be compared to like a turmoil in our souls. But the presence of Jesus in our life can calm the most terrible of emotional storms, and that's a picture that's been painted here. The tempest in our hearts can be turned into peace. When the cold, bleak wind of sorrow blows in our lives, we can find a calm and a comfort in the presence of Jesus. God in the flesh, Jesus incarnate, Emmanuel. So Jesus was there in the storm on the lake, and in their storm and fear, and he was able to dissipate both, to dissipate the fear in their hearts whilst at the same time dealing with the storm on the lake. But while all of that is true, and that's the factual accounts of what happens on this occasion, I don't want you to walk away from this without missing the major point that Matthew is trying to make. And that is the fact that Jesus has calmed the storm on the lake in order to demonstrate that he is God. In the flow of Matthew 8, this is taking Matthew's point to a new level than that of the previous group of 3 miracles. There we saw that Jesus had power over disease in the first set of miracles, but now he's demonstrating that he also has power over creation and nature itself. As someone has once said, Christ is here demonstrating the same authority that was expressed when the world was created through him by the word of his mouth. The authority that brought the world into existence, in fact the whole universe into existence. Look at Hebrews 1 verse 1, that same power and authority can certainly control the elements in nature on that particular day. Jesus was demonstrating through this miracle that he is indeed the Lord of creation, and that's the point of this miracle. In the final analysis, Jesus stills the storm to demonstrate to his disciples that he had not only previously shown he had power over illness, but now that he has power over nature itself, and to teach them that he can also deliver them from any storms in life that they might face. One other last word before we go on to the next miracle. These guys, you've got to know, were already following the Lord, right? You see that? So don't miss out on the fact that following the Lord doesn't mean that you won't encounter storms in life. They were with him literally in the same boat. That's an expression we use, isn't it, today? And they were encountering a storm. Sometimes people can get the idea that if you're following the Lord, if you make a decision to become a Christian and follow Christ, that you won't have trouble in your life. Well, my friend, life is actually full of trouble. The Bible tells us that. I often say to people who are telling me about the trouble they're having in life, I just say, well, welcome to life. I probably think you've heard me say something like that several times in our Bible study times together over these last few years. Have you ever heard me say, well, that's life, so get used to it? Life is full of trouble, and that's not just me speaking, that is the Word of God speaking also. But in this case, what Jesus does is demonstrate, yes, that he's God in flesh, but also that he can deal with anything, absolutely anything, that life will throw at you or whatever cards are dealt for you. Okay, there's a second miracle that begins at verse 28, after which Jesus will get in the boat again and once again leave to go to another region of Galilee. So let's read together and look at that miracle. When he had come to the other side, so this crossed the lake after the storm, to the country of the Gadarenes, there met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, What have you to do with us, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come to torment us before the time? Now a good way off from them there was a herd of swine feeding. So the demons begged him, saying, If you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine. And he said to them, Go. So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea, and perished in the water. Then those who had kept them fled, and they went into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed man. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. Okay, we see in the narrative here, he gets into a boat and crosses over, and he comes to the region of the Gadarenes. Sometimes it's spelt and pronounced Gadarenes. Either is okay. This is a famous story of Jesus casting out a demon. Maybe I should pause and talk about whether we, as Christians living in the 21st century, still believe in demons today. Do we even still believe in the devil? C.S. Lewis, a very famous professor at Oxford here in England after the war, he was a man who started out an atheist and became a Christian, said in his book The Screwtape Letters that there are 2 equal and opposite errors into which the human race can fall when it comes to regarding the idea of demons and the devil. One is to disbelieve their existence altogether, and the other is to believe but to have an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They, he said, meaning the devils, are equally pleased by both errors. You see, you can take one of 2 extremes when approaching this if you're not careful when it comes to the demonic and demonic activity. You can just brush it off at non-existent, or you can become unhealthily obsessed with it. I believe the true middle ground is to acknowledge that absolutely the Bible teaches that there is a devil and that there are demons, no less than what's what we're seeing Jesus deal with here. Here we are today, picking up at Matthew chapter 8, verses 28, and we'll be going through into the first 10 verses of chapter 9. And we're looking at this series of 3 miracles that are put together one after another, 3 groups of 3, with a little bit of teaching about discipleship in between. And we're picking up in the second miracle of the second set of 3, and that begins at verse 28, after which we see Jesus will get into a boat again and once again leave to go to another region of the Galilee to do some more work, but let's remind ourselves of where we're up to right now. So picking up in verse 28 and 29, it tells us, When he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, there met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, "What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now, isn't that interesting? The demons recognized that Jesus was the Son of God. Now, that's not just describing who he is, that's also a messianic title they're using, and that many believe is an indication that they are recognizing him not just on the surface level of what that means about him as a child of God, but also they're recognizing that beyond that, that he is the promised Messiah of God. And it's worth noting that the scholars of that time tell us that it was absolutely commonly believed and accepted that when the Messiah came, there would be a judgment in which all the demons would be destroyed. So here they are, and they're seen to recognize that he's the Son of God, and that the fact that they know that at the final judgment, as they would have believed, that they themselves would be destroyed. So it's an indication of the depth of their understanding of who is standing before them, as to who he was and what he could do. And their fear was that they were going potentially to destroy them that day, before they thought the time, which would have had occurred, the final judgment. So listen to what they say in response. Gives us a little bit of information first in verse 30, which says, "Now a good way off from them there was a herd of many swine, a large herd of pigs feeding, and then the demons begging him say, 'If you cast us out, permit us to go into the herd of swine.' And he said to them, 'Go.' So when they came out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water." So the demons, they make this strange request, and they ask that if he does cast them out, that they can be allowed to re-enter, or be reincarnated, if you like, into this herd of pigs. And Jesus agrees to that and says, "Go." Now look at what happens in verse 33. It tells us, "Then those who kept them fled, and they went into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men." So notice, they're not just describing the events of the casting out, they're also describing to the people of the city the healing. So they told the people in the city everything that had happened, and behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to depart their region. Isn't that amazing? The demons, they got it. They recognized who Jesus was, but the local people, they didn't. Why, if you had someone appear among you and heal a very well-known couple of very troubled men by casting out demons, and the fact that even those demons recognized him as both being the Messiah and the Son of God, why would you miss the importance of what this meant? And worse still, why would you ask such a person to leave your region? But that's what these local people from the local city did. One commentator I read about this said, "This is human selfishness at its worst." It did not matter to these local people that these two men had been delivered from their illness and their affliction. The locals' attitude was, "I don't care about what happened to anybody else." It was just the fear that Jesus might threaten their livelihood that concerned them, because clearly there would have been a huge financial impact for the loss of a large herd of pigs. So they tell him to go. And we'll see in the next chapter that that's exactly what Jesus does. But let's think about this miracle for a minute. This miracle demonstrates, of course, that Jesus is the Messiah, and that the Messiah could have the power to destroy demons, and that he's the Son of God. But the important thing it's saying is, look, through this miracle, we can see the Messiah, Jesus Christ, has power over Satan and the demonic realms. A secondary point is also to show what Satan can do to people if they let him into their lives, how he can control them, rob them of their sanity, their self-control, fill them with fear, even rob them not only of their joy and ability to live a life of peace, but rob them of their very friends and family and the society around them. You see, society often isolates such people, but Jesus demonstrates here that he can restore people who are incredibly lost. He can restore them to both peace, sanity, and potentially into society. But let me suggest that the flow of the miracles contained here in Matthew's account, they ratchet up another notch. they rise up the levels of the importance and the significance of them as these miracles progress. Jesus, in the opening group of these three miracles, demonstrated he had power over disease. He then demonstrated he had power over nature when he calmed the storm in the lake. And now he has demonstrating he even has power over the very demonic realm itself. So what else are we going to cover as we progress through these miracles? Well, if you stick around, you will see it gets even more spectacular. So let's pick up the text at the beginning of chapter 9, where the first 3 verses tells us, "So Jesus got into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own city. Then behold, they brought him to a paralytic lying on a bed. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, 'Son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven you.' And at once some of the scribes said within themselves, 'This man blasphemes.'" So Jesus, he's delivered someone from demonic oppression, and the religious hierarchy aren't happy. But when he tells someone their sins are forgiven, well, they actually go berserk. Why so? Well, before I answer that and go into the details, I want to point out something. If you've been following me through this gospel account of Matthew, it's very important to remember what the very first miracle that Matthew chose to describe for us was. Can you remember? It was the cleansing of the man with leprosy. I wonder, do you remember what Jesus told that man to do after he had healed him? Do you remember he said, "Go to the temple and tell the priests what has happened and give the prescribed offering that Moses said for such a miraculous event"? Now notice the text carefully. In verse 3 says this, "Some of the scribes said within themselves, 'This man blasphemed.'" Now Bible experts say that the language used here points out something which we may not pick up in the translation. This phrase, "some of the scribes," refers to the fact that these are high-ranking scribes, which means that it's very likely that these were some of the religious leaders who would have come all the way from Jerusalem. They'd ended up in Capernaum, and they'd done that because they'd come to check on what was going on, and already they were skeptical. So they'd come all the way from Jerusalem and come to see what was going on, and part of the reason they had come was probably because they were the ones who had seen the man with leprosy. Jesus had cleansed the leper and sent him to them, and the priests had come out here to Capernaum because it was part of their job to determine if anyone who either claimed to be the Messiah was genuine, or miracles were being done that would normally be attributed and ascribed to the coming of the Messiah. They were there to see if that is what was really going on. But it seems they arrive here today and they've already made up their minds. So they've actually come just to examine Jesus. And the first thing he says to someone right in front of them, he says, "I forgive you of your sins." And look at their reaction. They say, "Wow, he is blaspheming." And they say that because, of course, they know that only God can forgive sin. So by Jesus in saying this, he must absolutely be claiming to be God. Imagine me coming here today on this podcast and saying, "You know what? I can heal people in my own authority. Jeremy McCandless has the ability to heal people. Not God, me, myself." And also to say, "I can forgive you of your sins." If I was to do that sort of thing, you'd rightly think I was claiming to be God. I was overstepping the mark. I was myself claiming to be God himself and have only the powers that only God has. Or maybe you might just think, well, he's lost his marbles. Well, that may be, but what's going on here is Jesus says, "You are forgiven" to this man. And then he goes on to explain in no uncertain terms why he is able to do this. And his explanation and his reaction to what they said is really quite fascinating. And it's straight down the line between their eyes. And it tells us in verses 4 to 6, "But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, 'Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, arise and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins.' Then he said to the paralytic, 'Arise, take up your bed and walk, and go to your house.'" Now, in addition to what I've just said about this, it's helpful to understand what this means if you know that the religious leaders of Jesus' day taught that all suffering was due to sin. Jesus didn't believe that, but that's what they believed. John chapter 5 states it even more clearly. It's implied here, but it's clearly stated. And if you've got time, pop in and have a look at John 5, and it will see Jesus actually teaching that. So Jesus says to them now, remember, he's talking to people who believe that the suffering of this paralyzed man is due to his personal sin. Obviously, sin can affect all of us in ways, and the effects of sin and the fall of man do have effects on our general health and well-being. But it's not the same thing as saying that individual illness is the result of personal sin. So that's why he says, which is it easier for me to say to you, you're forgiven, or to heal the guy? In other words, what he's doing is, you know what, saying something like this is easy. Anybody could claim it and say this sort of thing. But that doesn't in itself prove it. So in this case, for him to heal this guy, because those guys, the religious leaders, thought that it was sin that has caused his suffering, he then says he's going to prove to them that he can also forgive him of any sin. So get the point? He tells the guy his sins are forgiven and to pick up his bed and walk. So Jesus has chosen to ratchet it up another notch, another level, by saying not only can he make the sick well, but that he can actually forgive sin. I believe this miracle is told here at this point, not just to demonstrate that Jesus can heal people, because after all the gospel accounts are full of that. It's more than that. It's more about demonstrating he's compassionate, though he was. This account is given to demonstrate that he has authority, power to heal, and authority to forgive sin, the authority of God himself. In fact, he specifically says that in verse 5. He says, so that you may know the Son of Man has power. And the Greek word power, translated here, can also be translated as authority. That's why I'm doing this, he says. So again, Jesus is demonstrating his authority. He's demonstrating that not only is he the Messiah, but also that he is God. The Messiah, the Saviour, the one who can forgive us from our sin. And that's the point of this miracle. Now, there were 3 miracles, and I contend that in this second group of 3, they're all given to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the King of Israel, but also that he has the power to forgive sin. Now, at this point, again at the end of the second section of 3 miracles, we have a diversion into him speaking about and applying it into the realm of discipleship and what it means in our lives, just like he did when after he'd done his first set of 3 miracles. So let's pick up the text in verse 9 and see what he says. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, follow me. So Matthew arose and followed him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house, and then, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. So let's pause at this point, because this is Matthew taking a time out following the second set of miracles to consider discipleship again and to present a new step forward in Jesus' calling of disciples. Just like at the end of the first 3 miracles, there is something here to be said about what discipleship really means. Firstly, we see him meet and call this fellow called Matthew, and the text tells us that Matthew was a tax collector, and Jesus says to him, follow me. Now, we need to pause here for a minute and talk about tax collectors, particularly at that time. As an aside, I think you might find it interesting. I'm sure we all love to pay all kinds of taxes. I think if you understand I'm being ironic at this point, I just want you to know that this attitude towards the paying of tax is nothing new under the sun. And tax itself is something that has not been invented by us recently. At that time, there were all kinds of different taxes. There was a ground tax by which a man had to pay 1/10 of his grain. And if he produced fruit, 1/5 of his fruit of the vine was to be paid to the government, either in cash or in kind. And there was also an income tax. Did you know there was an income tax at the time of Jesus? This might amaze you if I told you the income tax that people had to pay in Jesus' day was 1%. And by the way, did you know that when income tax first started in the UK, and for that matter in the United States, I believe, it also was introduced at 1%, and it was paid by every male aged 14 to 65 and every female from 20 to 65. There were all kinds of other taxes also due during the Roman occupation of the Holy Land. There was a duty on anything that could be applied on goods if they were transported or imported or exported across the border, and that ranged from 2.5% to 12.5%. Tax had to be paid just to travel on the main roads with goods for sale, or to cross bridges, or to enter marketplaces, or even to enter towns, or enter a town via a harbour. There were taxes on packed animals carrying goods. There were taxes that were applied based on the number of wheels or axles on a cart, and there were taxes on goods bought and sold. So maybe you thought taxes were something new. Maybe you thought we have a lot of tax to pay today. Well, you might say the Romans matched us in many ways, and even in this way. But the point is, Matthew was one of these guys. He was a tax collector, and the tax collectors were the most hated guys amongst the Jewish community, because they were collecting money for the occupying force, for the Romans to pay their taxes. When a country or a region was conquered by Rome, they gave the job of collecting all these local taxes to the person who would make the highest bid, the one who was prepared to offer the Roman authorities the most for the right to collect the taxes. And of course, this created a really unhealthy dynamic. You can imagine, can't you? The tax collector would then be authorized to go and collect whatever they could in tax. And generally, they were dishonest. So the Jews hated them. They hated them so much that they were banned from attending the synagogue. The vast majority of them were Jewish themselves, but they'd chosen to go into cahoots with the local Romans in what would become virtually an oppression, a financial oppression of the people. So not only were they banned from the synagogue, they were included in the Levitical law as being unclean, just like the animals and the beasts that were declared unclean. And also, as an aside, they were also forbidden ever to be a witness in court. These guys, these tax collectors, were the most despised and detested class. They were considered collaborators and unpatriotic, for they were working for Rome. And my point in telling you this is that Jesus chooses one of them to be his disciple. Jesus said to the most unlikely person, "Follow me." And Matthew did that. And as a matter of fact, the Bible adds the aside and tells us that he left everything to follow him. Now that's significant, for when he quit his job for the Romans, they would fill it immediately with someone else, and there were plenty of people who would have taken it in his place. So he, by choosing to follow Jesus, would indeed have left everything back again. He could not have gone back to his old job again. You could argue that Peter, James and John were fishermen, and they could have gone back to their boats. The boat would have still been there, the fish would have still been there. But Matthew, in a sense, he had no boat to go back to. He really, if you don't mind me mixing my metaphors, he'd burned all his bridges, so to speak. He couldn't go back again. Almost everybody who studies this passage concluded that Matthew gave up a lot to follow Jesus. But he also decided that he wanted to introduce some others from his circle of same like-minded people, sinners and tax collectors. He wanted to introduce them to Christ, so it appears he threw a sort of what we would today call an evangelistic party. But things at that place didn't quite work out as he imagined. We've arrived at a point where we've just seen Matthew. Remember, he was the tax collector. He's decided to accept the call of Jesus on his life, and he's going to follow him. Because Matthew was a tax collector, for him that meant he was completely leaving his old life behind. But things don't go as planned, because the Pharisees have become aware of what's going on. So let's remind ourselves. We'll go back a verse and reread a verse from last time, and then we'll just pick up so we know where we are in the actual main text. So we're picking up at Matthew 9, verse 9, reading through to 11, which tells us this. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he, that being Matthew, arose and followed him. So that's like I just said. The text continues. Now it happened, as Jesus sat at the table in the house, that behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" So at this point, the Pharisees work out what's going on. But wait a minute, the Pharisees, where did they come from? The Pharisees, they were based in Jerusalem. What are they doing up here in Galilee and in Capernaum? Now, you may remember earlier on, the beginning of the section of Matthew's account that covers the miracles of Jesus, the first thing we saw was Jesus heal a man with leprosy, and he's told that cured man to go to the temple to be examined by the Pharisaic leadership. So now it appears that they have come down to Capernaum as a follow-up to that, to check on this fellow who, from their point of view, is displaying, shall we say, messianic properties in the fact that he's doing these types of healings. And they arrive, and when they witness him curing a paralytic, and particularly when they see Jesus forgiving him of his sins, they immediately, on the spot, reach the conclusion that this is blasphemy. So they're getting off on the wrong foot immediately. So let's see how Jesus reacts to these events and what they're thinking. When Jesus heard that, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." That, by the way, is a quotation from Hosea 6, by the way. "For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So the Pharisees, they're indignant, they're outraged that Jesus would first of all sit down with sinners. Now, let's just pause right there for a moment and say, is there anything wrong with Jesus sitting down and eating with tax collectors? Well, no, there isn't. The Mosaic law didn't say that he couldn't do that. It did say that you should not eat unclean food. But here's what the Pharisees did with that rule, just like they did with other rules. They said, the Mosaic law, it just says you can't eat unclean food. So they then added on the idea, the thinking that if you sit down and eat with Gentiles or sinners, now Gentiles just mean anyone who wasn't Jewish, then the likelihood is that probably they might serve you with something that might be, if not unclean itself, then in its preparation or in the handling of it might be ceremoniously unclean. So that means that they concluded that you can't eat with anybody else, anyone at all for that matter of fact. So they were applying their legalistic laws to what Jesus is doing here. They're criticizing him for eating with the public and with what they perceive as sinners. But Jesus has a great answer. He actually quotes Isaiah 66, which in turn is quoted by Hosea as well. And he says, look, God doesn't want that type of sacrifice. What he wants is mercy. God doesn't want religious rituals and rules. He wants us to manifest his love and his grace and mercy to people. And then Jesus says, I didn't come to call righteous people. I came to call sinners to repent. So on another level, Jesus is saying to these Pharisees, look, I didn't come to call you Pharisees today. I didn't call you to follow me because you don't even recognize that you're a sinner and that you need salvation. You think you're holy and righteous and you have no need of what I have to offer. So this is a critical point. He says, you're criticizing me for eating with the public, with sinners, as they say, but these are the very people I have come to save. If you want to be made right with God, to qualify, you must be a sinner. That's all he's saying. Self-righteous people, they don't think they need any intervention by God. And Jesus is saying, look, I'm sitting down here with sinners because they're the very people that I've come to save. It's like someone saying to a doctor, why are you getting involved with all these sick people? Well, that's the first attack, and now other attacks follow thick and fast. Other objections and hostility towards Jesus is manifest ever increasingly from this point forward. And it now talks about some of the followers of John the Baptist, and they come and they question him about, of all things, fasting. Picking up at verse 14, it tells us, Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus' answer to them, another figurative response, Can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. So we see here next some of the followers of John the Baptist. They come and object because his disciples aren't fasting. Now, the Mosaic law did require some fasting. But do you know what the Old Testament actually said about the requirement to fast? It obligated it just 1 day of fasting a year. Now, people could fast occasionally on other days when they felt prompted by God to do it, but the obligation within the Old Testament law was 1 day of fasting a year. But the Jewish leadership of Jesus' day, they'd added some other obligated fast days. And then the Pharisees, they come along later, and not to be outdone by the regular Jews of that day, they created this system where they actually fasted 2 days every week. It's important to understand that that's the background here, because it appears that some of the followers of John the Baptist, they too followed that line of thinking, and they began to fast twice a week. And the criticism of them to Jesus and his disciples is, Why do you and your followers not fast like us? And Jesus answers their criticism with an analogy. He says, because the bridegroom is here, meaning if the wedding day is today, why would a wedding party want to be in mourning? When a couple got married in those days, they didn't go on away on a honeymoon like we do today afterwards. They stayed home, and all their friends gathered and came to see them, and they would celebrate, and that celebration would go on for several days, in fact up to a week usually. During that week of a sort of their version of a honeymoon, the couple were treated like a king and queen, and they had really an extended party. So Jesus says, look, in this situation, I am the bridegroom, and these people here are the friends of the bridegroom. So the reason my disciples are not fasting is because this is the time for celebration. You see, fasting was originally done as a sign of repentance or of mourning. So he's saying after the bridegroom and the bride leave, that's the point at which they will fast and mourn. The main point here Jesus is addressing, but the main point Jesus is responding to here is the fact that they're critical of him because he doesn't have disciples who fast. Instead, they're celebrating. Now, this is ironic because John the Baptist had specifically come to make way and tell them the Messiah was coming. So why would they want to respond to that good news with displayed signs of mourning? He is here now, John the Baptist told them, and he is here now in front of them, and they should have come to see him and rejoice. And instead, they come out complaining and moaning. Jesus then goes on to say this. Verse 16, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment, and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskin breaks, and the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. So here we go, another analogy. So what's Jesus saying here? Well, he's saying, I didn't come to just add something new to this old religious system. And he does this by illustrating it with the idea of the cloth and the fact that you don't pour new wine into old wineskins. Now, as you may know, they didn't have bottles for their wine in those days. They held the wine in wineskins. And when wine fermented, it expanded, and the skins would expand with them. So if you put new wine in an old wineskin that had already been stretched, and would then, when it was empty, turn brittle, it would obviously burst when the wine fermented. When the new wine was poured into the appropriate new wineskin, it fermented and the skin was able to expand with it contained within it. So Jesus here is using this analogy to say, look, you're coming and you're criticizing me, but you're criticizing me based on the old Pharisaic system. And I'm here to tell you, I'm not using that old religious system to make value judgments on anyone. I'm not trying to build on that way of thinking. I'm doing something new, something brand new. These guys have tried to contain the gift of the salvation of God. That's what he's pointing out by the way they'd constructed and adapted and manipulated God's word. They had tried to contain the gift of the salvation of God, a gift that had always been available to all people throughout all history if they embraced it. But he says, I've come to sweep that old restricted way of thinking, the things that you're trying to hold on to it and contain it in, by offering something new, hence the metaphor of a new wineskin. Okay, folks, I've reached the point where I would like to sum up not only what I've been saying today, but also this last couple of days spent on these second three miracles. I have one or two themes I want to draw your attention to and draw out of this passage. The point is that Jesus did another three miracles here, a second group of three, to prove that he was the Messiah. Then at the end of these three miraculous events, he calls people to discipleship. He calls people to follow him, and he is seen to say, follow me, to Matthew himself, the very writer of this account. Now, having done that, he then faces the onslaught, the ongoing criticism from the Pharisees, and sadly from some of the disciples of John the Baptist himself. They both come criticizing him. Okay, so let me try and sum up what this section is trying to teach us, what I believe it's trying to teach us. When Jesus was seen to demonstrate that he was the Messiah before their very eyes, some people are seen to commit themselves to follow him immediately, but others just complain and criticize. And isn't that just the same today? So let me try and break down these recent miraculous events described here over the last couple of days for you, the second group of miracles, and what they mean. Jesus is the Messiah. That's the overarching point of these two chapters that cover all these miracles. And having demonstrated power over things in the first set of miracles, things that supposedly should make us unclean, like defilement and disease, as some call it, he did that in the opening verses of chapter 8, which we looked at last week. Jesus, in this second section, this new set of three miracles, he now shows us power over nature, demons, and sin. You see, Jesus can bring peace even to those most clearly afflicted by even demonic activity, as well as those stricken with illness. The next set of miracles that we've been looking at here illustrate that he's a healer who came to bring spiritual help to sinners, and that he's the bridegroom who came to give spiritual joy to the miserable and sad, to make life a celebration, not a funeral. And the illustration of the cloth reminds us that he came to bring spiritual wholeness. He didn't just come to patch us up so that we can later on fall apart again. And the image of the wineskin teaches that he gave spiritual fullness. Jewish religious legalism had become a worn-out, brittle old wineskin that was so brittle that it would burst if you put it under any spiritual pressure at all. Jesus did not come to renovate or fix the extra laws that the Jewish hierarchy had tagged on. He didn't come to do that. He didn't come to address the problems of faith by adding more rules. He came to do something completely new. Jesus here is seen as the Messiah who forgives sins, the Messiah who has the power over nature, the Messiah who has the power over disease, the Messiah who has the power over demons. Jesus is the Messiah who has power over and who offers all. Now, some didn't like that. Clearly the Pharisees didn't like it, and sadly some even of the disciples of John the Baptist didn't like it. They just didn't get it. It's amazing it's how some people can have the truth stare them in the eye and they don't get it. How some people can look at the Bible and read the Bible and still not get it. When Jesus spoke, he didn't want to be the first of many wise men and prophets. His disciples immediately recognized that, and they made the decision immediately to follow him. And thereafter, they went around with him, doing what he did with him, picking his brain everywhere he went. They went thereafter. It's amazing to me that all these people, they actually witnessed the same miracles, and still some just didn't get it. Some witnessed what they did, and they were more concerned with the preservation of their own perceived holiness, or even just the religious tradition, without even thinking about helping another person. They were like doctors who refused to visit the sick, and that's why I believe Jesus uses that particular analogy for them to see. They didn't help people. They didn't help people even in the most dire need. And they didn't do it in case they were infected by what they perceived as some sort of spiritual infection. Their spiritual belief system was so flimsy and so broken and so brittle that they felt it could be broken down by just associating or being in the company of outsiders. How ironic is that? Essentially, their religion had become selfish. They were more concerned with criticism than encouragement. They were more concerned to point out the faults of all other people than to help people overcome any perceived faults. When a doctor sees someone today with a particularly unpleasant condition, should we say, should they just look at it and be disgusted by it, or should they be filled with a desire to try and help? Our first instincts as Christians, no matter what we see and face in life, should never be to condemn that person. Our first instinct should be to help them understand the love of God in their life and experience and practice the goodness of God in their life, and thereby receive healing and restoration. Instead of condemnation, we should be teaching the forgiveness of God. What would the health service be like in any of our countries if the medical professions were only concerned with the diagnosing of diseases, but not least interested in trying to cure the disease or help people who are afflicted with it? So what these people do here, when confronted with the miracle-working power of God in bringing healing and compassion to ordinary people, they just gripe and complain. But worse than that, they spread rumours. Even rumours against the Lord, even rumours and badly disposed misinformation about God himself. So friends, this passage can be summed up very simply. Number one, it wants to tell us Jesus is the Messiah. Number two, it illustrates that some will not get that and will never get that. When confronted with it, some just won't get it. And then number three, some people are going to be dead against it. And they'll be from the beginning, no matter what they see. But if we do get it, if we do recognize that Jesus, as seen here, is the Messiah, then simply there are two things that we need to do. Firstly, we need to believe. We need to believe in Jesus Christ. Now, last week I explained the difference between what I called sonship and discipleship. By believing, it means you become a child of God, a son of God, a daughter of God, and as a child of God, that entitles you to the blessings and inheritance of God. It's very simple. You simply need to believe, number one, that Jesus is the Son of God, who died and who rose from the dead, and trust in him. That means by doing that, you are given the gift of eternal life. But to do that, all you have to do is believe and to trust in him and him alone. The Bible actually tells us the gift of God is eternal life in Romans 6:20, and all we have to do to get the gift of eternal life is trust Jesus. Jesus who died for us, and by doing that you immediately become a child of God. So number one is simply you've just got to believe and believe those things. But point two is you also need to follow him. The point of this passage is that if Jesus is the Messiah, not only do you need to believe in him, but you have to make the decision to follow him. Notice that's exactly what he said. And he said to Matthew, he said, follow me. So today, what this is teaching and what I'm asking you is I'm not asking you to follow a church. I'm not even asking you to follow a doctrine. I'm not asking you to follow a movement. I'm not even asking you to follow me or my teaching ministry. I'm asking you to follow Jesus, because that's what he asked you to do. This is about a personal relationship, a decision between you and Jesus Christ. One that begins with saying, I believe, and I'm trusting in you, and one that acknowledges this by saying, you know what, I know I'm a sinner, and I know that as Messiah you died for my sin, and I'm trusting you. That establishes the relationship that then should be continuing by you choosing to follow him. It's continued because you can now say, you know what, by doing that I now know that God is my Father, and where you lead me I'm okay with that. I will follow, meaning simply I will obey. I wonder, when you were a child, did you ever, like me, play follow the leader? Whatever the leader did, you mimicked? It was a really simple game, folks, and in that respect, the Christian life is really simple and straightforward, at least in the practical aspect of the Christian life. It's simply about mimicking everything, doing everything he did, trying to do everything as best you can that Jesus did. On top of that list of doing is the fact that you should try and love people like he loved people. Someone once put it like this. They noted that Matthew lost and Matthew found. What he lost that day when he made the decision to follow Jesus was a comfortable, financially secure job, but he found his eternal destiny. He lost a good income, but he found honour. He lost comfortable security, but he found a life of adventure, one of which he could never have dreamed of. Now, it may be that if you accept the challenge of Christ to follow him, we ourselves may also find ourselves poor in some material things. It may be that our worldly ambitions will have to be put in the background. But beyond that, without question, we will find peace and joy and a new thrill in life that we could have never deemed possible. We're now operating on an entirely different, higher level. In Jesus Christ, any man or woman can find wealth surpassing anything that the world can promise, and can replace anything that they might have had to set aside or abandon for the sake of him. But the thing that's really important to say is that following the Lord is not just about leaving things behind. It's about gaining things. It's about gaining everything, in fact. Matthew lost a job, but he found his vocation, his purpose in life. He lost a good income, but he found other riches in other ways. He lost that material security and probably a relatively high standard of living, but he gained eternal security and union with God. And on top of that, he found the adventures of a life that he never could have imagined, and I'm sure never ceased to thrill him. He may have left the work of a Roman tax collector, but the Lord gave him the new task of an evangelist. And you know, if you think about it, from his writings, inspired by the Holy Spirit and sanctified by the Holy Spirit, comes this, the inspired Gospel of Matthew. Some today call it the first manual of the Christian faith, and others say it is one of the most important works ever written by a man. What a destiny for a local Jewish employed by the Romans, who upon hearing of the grace of our great God found a new life and a new mission by just meeting Jesus and making the decision to follow him. So may I ask you, what more could we want out of our life? What more could you or I do than commit to serving a Messiah such as this? Someone who demonstrated power over disease, over nature, over the whole demonic realm, also had the ability to forgive sin. So you today, my friends, well, we all have a choice. We can be like the Pharisees. We can stand back. We can be self-righteous. We can have a self-righteous attitude, and we can criticize all this stuff, just like some of the people of Jesus' day did. Or we can make the decision to become a committed follower of Jesus Christ by obeying his command to follow him. And we can do that from this day forward. And we can only imagine what wonder awaits us.